So we're at Chaumont Barrens, one of the numerous alvar landscapes in northern New York, and the alvar landscape is unusual in that there are three biomes that come together here. We have a lot of prairie elements from the west, a lot of northern elements in the form of white spruce and balsam fir, and we have a lot of the temperate forest elements here. It originated from a very intense glaciation and erosion, and following that erosion, a big slab of limestone. In some places the limestone has numerous crevices or grikes, and in some places it's very flat. And where it's flat, it takes decades to hundreds of years for the vegetation to start to form, and that beginning process starts with algae and mosses colonizing the rock surface and starting to accumulate organic matter. And then over time, some of the plants that are most tolerant of drought, like the plant in bloom here, the balsam ragworts, Pachyra paperculus, they are able to occupy these developing soils. And over time, decades to hundreds of years, maybe thousands of years, more soil accumulates and more complex communities form. For example, alvar grasslands. And over more time, you start to get conifer woodlands. And even with more soil development, you get some very beautiful, very rich limestone woodlands. You might wonder why these landscapes, how can they be maintained? There's a speculation that fire was historically important on these landscapes. Grazing was historically important. We know that deer browsing is very intense currently on these landscapes. But drought probably is maybe the primary factor that keeps a lot of these open areas from becoming colonized by shrubs and trees. And we see this every 2 or 3 years. After looking at these for decades up here, we'll get very distinct, on a year-to-year basis, very distinct blooms of different plants that represent the prior effects of drought. Or, on the other hand, very wet years will have a huge influence on the plants that develop. There's another unique feature of these two other unique features of this landscape that explain the unusual species here. So there are lots of species here that are common in most places in the eastern United States, but there are so many species that are very unique to here because the little soil there is high in calcium. It's a very high pH. The pHs might range from 6, 6.5 up to 8 in some places. And so there are only a few plants that are well adapted to those high pHs. The other substrate characteristic that's really important is that it's very poor in nutrients. And so anything that changes that will change the dynamics of this place. So it's very low in nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus. And so the species here, it's very similar to a ompotrophic, oligotrophic bog in that they're very poor in fertility, and in this case, often incredibly droughty. So a combination of drought and the ongoing very poor nutrient levels maintains this landscape much as you see here today. The geologic history of the alvar landscape is really fascinating, and you can really see a lot of it here. You see the Devonian fossils, the cephalopods and other fossils that represent that large ocean that was once here 450 or so million years ago. And then more recently, the effects of glaciation and how the glaciers, with that tremendous amount of ice and their force against the rock, created these huge flat plains of limestone. And with the erosion of that ice, of that meltwater, the huge crevices that were formed and the volume of ice and the volume of water that came from that melted ice really sculptured the landscape in a way that there are a few places I think in the Northeast that you can see such dramatic effects of the geologic history. And the plants sort out accordingly. It's the plants represent what has happened in the past and the underlying conditions. If it wasn't for those underlying conditions, if if the conditions were all uniform, then the vegetation wouldn't be as interesting, so complex as it is at this alvar and all alvars in New York State. So there are a lot of rare plants on the alvar landscape, and they come from various places throughout the Northeast. One that is particularly rare is called Carex crawlii, the crawl sedge, and it's this short little stubby, coarse textured sedge. The perigynia are forming right now. And it has a really interesting place in the landscape in the alvar. It's on these advancing fronts of vegetation. So the first thing that happens for vegetation to get onto the pavement is mosses and algae will start to form a mat. And for various reasons, the Carex crawlii is able to advance on that mat. One reason that it's able to do that is rhizomatous. It's actually, these are all connected plants, and so it can send out a shoot in advance of the mother plant being sacrificed. And as a seedling, if you put a seedling out here, it wouldn't have much of a chance because it would just probably not have the nurturing of the mother plant. So it's a really fascinating plant that takes advantage of this unique ecology of these very open patches right next to the pavement. The only other plant that's in here in this particular patch is the balsam ragwort, Pachyra papriculus.